Okay, so welcome everybody to this Zoom meeting, and my name is Simon. I'll be hosting this presentation for you today, and we're going to be talking about Saturn and the path to individuation. So I want to first, before I get into really sharing the material that I want to enrich your lives with today, at least, I want to give you a little bit of a background as to what was the actual intention that brought me not only to share this material in this way, but also maybe a sense of the values that I feel are connected to this material today. And hopefully by sharing with you my personal journey and my personal relationship to this topic today can inspire you to, as I said, begin looking at your own personal Saturn in your astrology chart and see how when we begin to live in alignment with an inner emotional reality that serves a path to awakening yourself and to awakening the soul and living in alignment with the soul, that this way of spiritual behavior is a lot more practical. It's a lot more simple. It doesn't require deep esoteric knowledge to bring you to a sense of enlightenment, but is actually something that you can practice every single day of your life, that when you're doing this, it brings you closer to the source and the remembrance of your own personal creation. And I feel that the core of this sharing today, from my point of view and the value that I have around it, is that where humanity and where people and all of our truths and all of our esoteric knowledge and the meaning of our existence, where it's been for some time, has brought us to a certain point. And that certain point, I believe, has completed its cycle. And so for a lot of us right now, we're witnessing the world go into a really, really strange phase of existence. And this phase of existence has a very profound theme to it that we don't really get to see completely every single day unfolding, because a lot of the moment-to-moment reality that we're dealing with clouds that, or doesn't cloud it. It's not something that we can't see in the sense that it's not visible. It's more that the trajectory of this unfolding evolution and this changing in direction for us is working at such a fast rate that it actually appears really, really slow. And it's a random thing that I'm sharing with you over here, but let me like capture your imagination about what I mean by this. And this is that the nature of change is happening so fast that we can't actually assimilate it. So what we are experiencing is bits of our reality being processed as much as we can process. And one of the reasons why I feel this way is because the context of the acceleration in which a new direction is occurring is reflecting to us the next step in our evolution. And that next step in our evolution is also revealing to us that our current space that we hold right now is limited or is outdated. And so the speed at which that evolution is moving and the context of our capacity to process the totality of what's happening is, in a sense, revealing to us why we try to make sense of what is occurring, and yet we can really only digest fragments of it. So this is my personal observation that I not only have witnessed with inside of myself, but have seen in every single person that I have spoken to, have inquired with, and I'm kind of fanatical in this process because I'm deeply fascinated by it. I like to investigate what I'm talking about. So I almost spend more of my time in conversation really trying to extract what it is that I'm seeing and observing and feeling, and then, trying to see if there's any essence of validity in what I'm sharing. And so I hope that for some of you that are on this call today and that are watching this after the fact, that if you resonate with what I'm sharing, feel free to really comment and let me know how your own personal digestion of this new direction in which we're experiencing is taking place. So that's one of the core threads that is deeply associated with this communication today, this dialogue with everybody today, and the sharing with you today. The other is the personal story that I have managed to cultivate inside of myself and also witness unfolding in me. And that has to do with the actual theme of the conversation, Saturn, the path to individuation. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of break down this idea of individuation being something that is, I like blue, you like green, we're different kind of thing. I want to open us up to see that when I talk about individuation, I mean the subtlety of your body's behavior reflects to you something that's so unique about yourself that no other person can actually have that specific DNA combination. Okay. For instance, for myself, part of my individuation process is recognizing that my body doesn't like a lot of chaos. It gets really unsettled when there's a lot of energy around me that's very chaotic, that's unstable on some level. And I notice that when I allow my body to interact with an environment that's calm, I not only am very receptive to whatever I feel I would like to digest, whether it be content, whether it be food, whether it be a conversation. And so the Saturn component that comes into this little sort of story here is, how do I allow my own personal authority to acknowledge that that is something that is essential for me? And each of us has this uniqueness about us that for most parts has been conditioned out of us. And again, as I go into the sharing today, I'll share with you the nature of how this is something that is just a byproduct of where we've been as a collective race. So when we look at the context of Saturn in our natal chart, what this conversation aims to do is to help maybe orientate your relationship to that natal Saturn in your chart in a way that breaks or opens it up to more than just the symbolism that you find on the internet. Okay, so for me, Saturn in Capricorn in the 10th house, or Saturn in the 10th house in Scorpio, sorry. Okay, so kind of general communication around astrology and Saturn in the 10th house, Scorpio says, needs to find empowerment in one's own authority. Okay, that's fantastic. And it gives us a core kind of framework for us to work with, and essential for everybody that is wanting to learn astrology to really see what it means to have your own life reflected back to you through the potential of this little chart that got this little symbol there. Yet, when we reach a point where that doesn't serve us anymore because it's just now our own kind of mental ideas about what that could potentially mean for us, there is an extra layer or layering or multi-dimensionality that gets sort of burst out of this curiosity to say there must be something more beyond it. We can't be limited by our own perception of what that is. So what is it for me? And so when you begin to play with any symbol in your astrology chart. And in particular for today's conversation, this is going to be around Saturn and the nature of Saturn in your chart. The broader we can actually access the nature of this symbolism or the symbols in your chart, the more profound we're going to experience what we are and who we are and what influences us, what shapes us, what is it that is held within the context of our own consciousness and psyche. So again, when you're looking at the Saturn in your chart, or any other planet for that matter, again, you're looking at your astrology chart, what you want to do is you want to nourish your own awareness. Because when your awareness interacts with that astrology chart, it reflects back to you where you are, because it's your consciousness that's influencing it. So that's why we can go to 4 or 5 different astrologers, and each astrologer will provide us with a deep intuitive perspective about the nature of what they see there. But there is still a limited container as to that symbolism is only that Saturn, and the capacity for what that holds is limited to that person's consciousness. And inside of myself, I feel that there is an important need for us to open up the multidimensionality that is held within that symbol, within each symbol. Okay? And for me personally, when I first began understanding evolutionary astrology as the gateway, right, I began to notice that there was this multidimensionality that was opening up for me as I interacted with it. But my chart never, I mean, when I first got into astrology and when I was talking to you today, my chart has not changed. Neither has it changed for you. The symbols are in the same place that they were the first day that you discovered them and where they are today. And yet, when you look at your Saturn in your chart, through the many different ways that you've investigated what it could be, you've seen how it's transformed itself, it's shaped itself, right? And yet, it's still the same chart that you discovered the first time you drew up your natal chart. So when I began to explore evolutionary astrology for myself, the experience for me was a realization that not only was I on a path to seek something that I didn't even know was going to land me in this position, but at a deep level, I knew that this was a trajectory that I was about to embark on, and that somehow along the lines, this is where I would end up, or this is the path that I would end up. And that is that the astrology opened me up to the emotional reality of our humanness, and it took away the mind. So now all of a sudden, when I began to look at Saturn, for instance, in the astrology chart, it had, okay, so conditioning, the boundaries, right? The boundaries within consciousness. What does that mean? The framework for which the soul chose this lifetime to evolve through. And yet at the same time, there's also the context that Saturn, in wherever it sits in your personal chart, carries a story with it. And what I've noticed with working with clients recently, that when I began to open and unbox the Saturn in the chart, it was like all of a sudden there was this family history, and grandparents were influencing grandparents that were influencing their parents, and then eventually the parent would influence the child, and there would be this whole lineage of themes that Saturn would play out. And you'd be like, wow, this is a fantastic way to really see the ancestral karma that gives, that comes with this symbolism. And then so from that space, not only did we change or open up just the front-facing essence of what you see when you first look at your chart and say, oh, I've got Saturn in the 10th house, and you read on the internet and it says, You know, this is a soul that needs to, you know, be responsible in their life. Okay. And so that's where it starts. And then as you kind of get deeper into your process, you begin to notice that, hold on, what happens if the context of that Saturn is fair enough? To a certain degree, there's responsibility associated with Saturn because it's where we learn to take responsibility for our own actions. But what happens if that Saturn is deeply traumatized because of experiences of the past through the grandparents, that the soul wants to actually break that paradigm of thinking and wants to make a new choice? And then all of a sudden, the conditioning of the outer world says this is what Saturn is, and then that actually becomes something that's really not, that's negative for the soul in that sense. And that's just an example that is illustrating the importance to awaken the Saturn consciousness in your chart, but also to awaken the consciousness in the chart, which is essentially you. Meaning that when we want to really become intimate with our chart, we can no longer sit with just the generic representation of it because it's limiting. Okay. So the value that I have towards the sharing today is not only how it's transformed my own life and how it consistently keeps on transforming my own life, but it is also a really great way to begin seeing that these archetypes, like for instance, Saturn and Uranus, play a very important role when we begin to see that our trajectory as a human race has the capacity to live in a way that has not been experienced in the past. And this is something that's very new. And if you go and listen to, it's called The Transition of the Ages by Jeffrey Wolf Green. It's a lecture that he did. And he talks about the nature of the Uranian field becoming available to humanity in a way in which the whole entire structure of the brain will change, and also how we will begin to embrace a reality that has never ever been created before. And how does that feel? Because remember, at this point in time, we want to be individual, and yet at the same time, we're still kind of bringing the conditioning of our own needs for security into the future, conditioning it. And so therefore, it's not really Uranian in that sense, because the whole impulse of Uranus is to go, no, we want to kind of reconfigure the whole entire structure of reality to the point where it doesn't even look the same. And how do we emotionally relate to that? So in a sense, there's an essence in today's conversation and sharing where I feel that as we begin to process the next step in our human evolution, that part of this experience for us is putting one foot in front of the next and going, we don't know what it is that this direction is taking us in. We don't know what it's about, but it is developing as we're going. How many of you thought that in 1998, right, that in 2018, you would be interacting on a program called Zoom, connecting to astrologers and people that would love to talk astrology and learn about themselves like that? How many of you thought that you would ever actually use a telephone that had touch screen on it? How many of you ever thought that there was the potential of creating augmented reality, that every single one of you at some point has used it on your phone, where you've gone into your little messenger thing over there and you've changed the way that your picture looks, to the capacity where Apple creates a certain amount of augmented reality glasses and somebody else across the globe is able to fix a specific, really highly technical piece of equipment using another person's eyes and expertise through this augmented reality. Okay, this is what I'm trying to explain here. And that's just one aspect of it. That's a little small piece of this. What happens when we begin to ask ourselves the question, when every single person decides to step into their own authority, which is what this conversation wants to do today, okay? When you start processing what I really mean by this, when you start recognizing what the Pluto in Sagittarius is with that Uranus and Neptune in Aquarius, want to do with their existence, and you watch the nature of how their behavior is changing relative to all of the technology and all of the new things that are in the world right now, then a lot of the things that we took for granted as what would just be there all the time might not actually be there. Just as the essence of the invention of the mobile phone with an 8 megapixel camera on the iPhone completely and utterly eradicated Kodak. There's no need for somebody to go and buy an actual physical camera that's only one-dimensional. Why would you use a one-dimensional thing unless you were specifically needing it for some specific project? 99% of the consensus or world would go, nope, I would rather choose something that has multi-dimensionals to it, i.e. multiple apps, multiple things, and it's multifunctioning, dimensions, Uranus. So the point here is that this path to individuation is not something as, oh, this is a little personality test that says I am the I can't remember exactly. There's 4 letters and it's INTJ. You know, that type of psychological test that gives you the personality type. That configuration is like amazing, but it's also very limiting in the sense that it puts us into categories. The individuation that I'm talking about is on a fractal level. Like when you see somebody, do you see their frequency? Do you see the energy, their energy and their frequency versus the physical form and their personality traits that are conditioned by society and influenced by the conditioning field and patterns that they would have had when they were growing up, as an example? So the inspiration lies in the capacity to truly, truly see what Uranus is actually trying to offer us here as the next phase in our evolutionary trajectory. In other words, awakening to ourselves beyond the Saturn realm. And how do we interface with that? Okay, cool. So let's jump onto a little screen sharing over here. Okay. How do I do this? Video, there we go. Okay, great. Okay, so before I kind of jump into this over here, I do want to express that the way that I've kind of structured this information has 2 phases to it. Okay, there's the phase that talks about an imprinting, and the imprinting is a collective conditioning field that influences the way that we as human beings at a, I'm going to use the word bioform, but let's just be more grounded over here. Your actual psychological, emotional, and mental state, how that is conditioned. Just like a baby, for instance, right? The baby has a brain that, if it was exposed to a series of traumas, would eventually develop a pattern within their psyche, and brain function would be in response to that. That's conditioning. And so we all, as human beings, live under this dome of collective conditioning. Okay? So this first phase is really going into a kind of Sagittarius realm and saying, here's a very big overview of the context of conditioning fields that we have related to, interacted with, and part of our genetic behavior. And then what that step outside of that conditioning field is going to look like to a certain degree, how you can watch it happen in yourself. And also, how does that correlate to the path of individuation that Saturn holds for us in relationship to Uranus? Okay. So I know that there's like just tons of information that I've already shared at this point in time. You know, take your time to digest it, watch the video over and over again. Okay. So as I said before, this is a Saturn, the path to individuation presentation today. And this is on the EA Zoom meetings, the 28th of June, 2018. And my name is SΥmµn, and you can find my work at www.raising-vibrations.com. Okay, that's my website. And like I said, you can find more of my work over there. Okay. Let's just keep it to the last 6,000 years, because that in and of itself is something that's deeply profound to grasp anyway. But let's just look at our own personal history and imagine for a moment that you're on this kind of little train, or let's not say a train, you're on a tour guide group, and you are going through this little history museum, and the first stop that you get to is the development of human relatability. Okay, so this initial conditioning phase, where it all begins from the past, is that we essentially have a pressure to survive. There's a necessity to survive. Our bodies have requirements that, if we don't meet, will ultimately reflect the elimination of our species. And so deeply, deeply ingrained within the psychology of not only our bodies, but within the structure of our brain, there is a response mechanism that says, I need to survive. We can easily relate to this by simply going, okay, I'm going to attempt to not eat for a day. And I'm also going to attempt to not drink for a day. At some point, you will start to feel that your body will say, bud, okay, look, I recognize that you're doing this little random test on me at the moment, but I need to let you know that for the last however old you are, I have been trained to tell you that at some point, when I get hungry, when I need nutrition, when I need fuel, I want to signal that to your brain, and you're going to go and respond to that. So there's this pressure within inside of us that supports our survival. We can actually correlate that in the brain as the brainstem and the primal brain, right? The first what's the word I'm looking for? Let's just say the first stage within our brain's development over there, the primal brain. Okay, requires it regulates the way that the body's blood works. It regulates, all of the things is encoded within the first stage of the brain's development. So we have this pressure to survive. Now let us contemplate this process of when we are in survival, we look outside of ourselves to something, and we ask ourselves the question, who or what will meet this need and be sensitive to this need for our survival to be met. Okay? And so if we look to the natural zodiac, this primitive survival mechanism is rooted in the archetype of Taurus. Okay? In fact, I'll just clear this over here. There it is there. The archetype of Taurus, survival, needs. Right? It's relative to the experience of something being born into this world. Let me just get a proper connection over here. Aries. And it moves just like the baby, just being born into the world, and it says, Mom, I need food. And right now, at this point in time, I am not interested in how much sleep you get, because when I need to eat, I'm going to tell you that. Okay, we can all relate to this experience. Every single one of us that is on this call right now or watching this video, at some point in your life, be it from the age of 0, when you were born, you went, I need to eat. I need to survive. So you ask the question to the mother, are you sensitive to my needs to survive? Okay, so there it is. There's the natural sextile from Taurus. all the way to Cancer. And the natural in conjunct all the way from Taurus to Libra. And again, if you can really, really want to go into this process, all the way to the opposition to Scorpio. So I will merge with something in relation to what will meet my emotional needs. Who is sensitive out there that I can merge with that can help me survive? All right. And so hopefully in what I'm sharing with everybody today, I'm also activating an essence of you to see that the depth in the Taurus archetype and the language that comes with it is not just simply Taurus survival, but actually how it's encoded. So if you've got a lot of Taurus in your chart, you can see how that archetype is developed. And I did a Zoom meeting maybe a month ago or something that talked about the Taurus archetype in that sense. So we have this need for our survival to be met. And so, oops. Oh, come on. Okay. It's actually going to completely and utterly take me away from it. Fine. Okay. So here we are, and we have this need to be met. And at the same time, we also look out into the cosmos and we see the sextile. I'm actually going to put the sextile in over here. Let's go back to the natural zodiac. There's the natural zodiac. There's the sextile between Taurus and Pisces. And that's when we begin to develop a relationship to source, to spirit. You have to remember, at the time in which this essential need is being developed, we don't know of the pineal gland. We don't know of the inner reality and the way that the body functions. We just know that there must be something that must be met, and is there anybody sensitive enough to meet it? So therefore, what naturally develops within ourselves is our relationship to our ecosystem and also to an existential savior. And out of the birthing of an existential savior comes the process in which we go, is there somebody out there? We look to the gods. We create this reality in which there is some form of being that is influencing our reality beyond our physical sense, that can provide us with this. And we create myth, and we create stories, and we create this whole entire relationship to beings that are here to help us. Because in that space, that psychological state, being in a need for survival and a pressure for survival, and having something that is going to meet our needs, that's sensitive enough, that's compassionate enough, that is willing to recognize our vulnerability, we develop the next phase of our conditioning field, the community. Okay, so my first question to everybody is, if you look at this picture that right now, and then look at the world that we live in today, is there any relatability? I don't see any mobile telephones. I don't see structures and schools and buildings and railways and electricity. I don't see cars with wheels that have petrol or fuel developments. I don't see any of that. So buried deep within our psychological and emotional and human biological conditioning field is the next phase, which is this limbic system. And we have a community. And then in this community, we find other people that now we can begin to relate to. Taurus in conjunct Libra, Taurus trining Cancer, sextile Cancer, sextile to Pisces and the natural zodiac. And so if the community bonds together, we develop a certain practice of faith. The faith that is within the community, the values that are held within the community, and the rules, the definition, the boundaries that are developed within this community. And this community would bring spiritual meaning. we all together would find God, or find that vulnerability, or sorry, not find that vulnerability, to apologize, find that being that is sensitive to our needs for survival in our vulnerable state. And so we cultivate and develop a whole entire process of conditioning that becomes family. And family then spreads off into different ways, and there are different dimensions of values and faith. And so the cultivation of our beingness gets birthed into, okay, this is my family, this is my tribe. Okay, and within the context of the tribe, this is the person that's going to look after the tribe, and you're going to be appointed the shaman, you're going to be appointed this, you're going to be appointed that, and you have a role within that place. And yet still we don't have individuation. We just have people being assigned to different places, fulfilling a role within a community that supports the underlying fear of survival and vulnerability, to be kind of like, we've got this under control. Does everybody follow with what I'm talking about here? Like when you begin to really grasp this process, you will begin to understand the framework in which the conditioning field, for most of you that have got a Uranian imprint on yourself, and you come into this world, you've got Uranus in the 11th house, Pluto in the 11th house, Mars conjunct Uranus, North Node in Aquarius, and you're like the black sheep of the tribe. You're the person that can't fit into the community. You can't, there's always something about your own process that carries deep rejection. You've got to feel guilty for choosing a different path, and so on and so forth. The context of that emotional behavior and woundedness that you carry is because of the conditioning field in which we have been in, and that we are breaking out of. Okay. That's why so many of you from 2012 onwards, as Uranus started to cause its little bit of it's huge sort of dialogue with Pluto in Capricorn and Uranus in Aries, everybody kind of broke out. And then all of a sudden you started noticing that your belief systems and faith didn't gel well with the community that you're in, or the people that in your family, and you broke away. And now all of a sudden you recognize that your own personal perception of things is what isolates you from it, or rejected, or excommunicated. All of these types of contexts exist within this mutation, within this process of change. And it comes from the conditioning field that is this. So the sensitivity gets met in the tribe, in the community, the Cancer Capricorn axis. It's very, very simple to see. Just look at any faith. I've recently been watching a TV show called Big Love that is rooted in the principle of polygamy and Mormonism, right? The Book of Mormon. And it's just deeply fascinating to me to see how belief systems shape the conditioning field of human psyche to the point where we sacrifice ourselves for the meaning of life through creating a meaning out of the fear and the pressure that stems from, is there anybody there that can meet our needs for sensitivity, vulnerability, and to live? So community arises out of the process, and within the community, like I said, there is certain faith, right? If you're a part of this principle and you choose to, show up and say, no, I don't want to reject it, then you're outside that conditioning field. And outside that conditioning field says you are straying, you are abandoning, you are going off target. And think about how difficult it is to leave a cult, as it were, that has its sort of boundaries defined through its faith, to the point where if you're outside of that, you actually you go through a traumatized state of breaking away from it. And the indoctrination that comes with it is simply just because of that unconscious, emotional, as I said, the needs for that survival to be met. So community forms, that's how we've got it up until now. And so a lot of us right now are deeply, deeply influenced by the conditioning field that is what family and community represents. And that is changing for us right now so much. Even to the point, if you ask yourself the question, do you feel comfortable in the EA Zoom meetings because you found a family online that was very different to the one that you grew up in? That transition, that sort of distribution of the way the communities operates relative to resonance is this coming sort of process, and we're a part of that. And that's what I mean about notice that this community that is EA Zoom meetings, as an example, or your astrology community, the groups on Facebook. Look at all the groups on Facebook. Just ask yourself that question: why did these materialize? How did they materialize? And what do they represent to us, or to me? What do they represent to you? And why do you associate yourself with it? Okay. So unfortunately, part of the process that comes along with this pressure, this birthing process, is that when we are in the boundaries of this community, we are also under the conditioning and influence of the elders within the community as well, within the people that have got higher rankings. And so this is where we start to get into patriarchal belief systems and truths, right? In which we as human race lived by these principles. And think about the context of somebody that was born into a family that didn't have any ranking within this community structure, and how there was this complete destruction of human self-worth because of the conditioning field in which the hierarchy of the community operated. So here's somebody that's born into a family that's, say, upper middle class, and they're roaming the streets, as it were, and they find somebody that they meet, and that the meeting process is one of the heart. So they meet somebody, and they meet in this relationship way that's of the heart, and of course the heart doesn't have this conditioning field, and so therefore what you have is the upper middle class person brings the girlfriend or the boyfriend home with them, and this person represents a lower tier, right? A less developed or nurtured or cultured personality. And so there's immediately judgment. You can't marry this person. You're not allowed to marry this person. And it's like, just the nature of that type of behavior is the manifestation of what originally started as our deep vulnerability needing to be sort of nurtured, and then our search for it, and then what we developed out of that. And there are good or healthy developed communities that support the things, this need, but then there are also the distortions that, again, as this is what we're talking about right now. And so you get born into this type of environment, and your life is trying to break out of the authority that is placed on you, that you don't get a choice over, unless you recognize that this conditioning field is repressing your own individuality. But that individuality can only exist if that is part of your path. And then that in and of itself is deeply traumatizing, because you have to challenge the status quo. You have to challenge the boundaries. You have to fight for it. You just look at history, and you can find people that were running against the grain, that not only were deeply persecuted, enter Uranus in 6th house, or enter Uranus in Virgo, deeply persecuted for the nature of their own individuation process that was a natural part of their life. Like, the unfolding experience of their existence was to individuate, and yet the struggle to actually allow that to be fully experienced was completely damaged because of the context of what held us together as a human race. So the authority gets claimed based on this hierarchical structure. And so through the need for it, for the Savior to rescue us, we create and look upside and we say, you are our creator, Heavenly Father. And so when we praise to you, you provide us with life. And so therefore this Taurus sextile Pisces energy develops. And then of course, Pisces also naturally squares Sagittarius. And so what you have here is the whole entire context of our value, for need for survival, relating to an existential savior, and then the belief system that we develop from that then becomes the conditioning field. And so The elders would impose their judgment if you did not stay. The elders would say that God would banish you from the kingdom of heaven or the garden, whatever it is, the community, as it were. All because the root of our security is around the Savior and the belief system and the rules and the values around it. Every single one of us, up until this point in time, has been deeply, deeply conditioned by this because of our own parents and because of their parents and because of their parents and so on and so forth. And your Saturn carries this in it. The context of your Saturn in your chart carries this. All right? Because each of us needed to emotionally relate to something and to be part of something. And right now, the context of that existence has been through community. I mean, you can even maybe go as far as to talk about the south node of Pluto and the south node of Saturn and the south node of Jupiter that all sits in Capricorn being very much what I'm talking about here. Okay. So what does the present look like? The present looks like this. It's about shock and surrender. Shock and surrender, because at some point, all of a sudden, we begin to recognize that there's a path for us that is different to the conditioning field and the community's ideals about what is essential. And so Uranian energy begins to become more prevalent. It begins to move through our biological human evolution more. It becomes more awakened within us. And as it becomes more awakened within us, we begin to see that we create shock through the rejection of the principles and ideals and perspectives and what trauma that comes with it, right? So the surrender part is the realization that you're surrendering yourself to something that is bigger than what you are, that is calling you beyond the context of our evolution, or sorry, not the context of our evolution, but the context of the evolution of the community and what it held and what it did. And to break out of that mold and to say, no longer does this support me. So I chose this picture specifically because the imagery that I want to create here is that every single person at some level, somewhere a point, maybe not every single person actually, but a lot of us have looked at a different faraway land and said, I would love to travel. I would love to take my suitcase and spread my wings and discover myself. I want to explore. And so part of that exploration, whether it be, you know, just leaving, if you're very, very in need for security at a very close pace, you know, just leave to the next town or to the next city, but at some point we look beyond and we seek something bigger than ourselves. And that requires us to challenge the community's values in this sense. So we need to say no to the collective identity and truth that is held within it. So my own personal story about this is that in 2005, I immigrated from South Africa to England. And part of that process was having to deal with my own brothers and sisters' sort of emotional feelings of being abandoned by myself, right? So my brother held like deep resentment towards me for abandoning him, because it was I needed to protect the family and stay there and, you know, get a job and do the thing that society told us that was the thing to do, because it was the value of the principles of the family and his principles. And he was a Cancerian sun with a couple of planets in the fourth house. So, you know, he very much wanted that tradition to stay on, the traditions. And yet my Uranus and Sagittarius in the 11th conjunct Jupiter needed that breaking away to find something beyond what I considered to be my most immediate environment. It was part of my individuation process. At the time, I didn't understand this. This is why this conversation is happening today, because the choice to say I'm changing my path, I'm leaving, is creating that shock. And that shock to the tribe that says, oh, but you can't do that. What happens if this happens? What happens if you die? What happens if that happens? Because the fears begin to arise out of the shock. In other words, the collective emotional imprinting arises through their language that is embedded in judgment, right? So the present is that every single person at some level is beginning to recognize that there's a need to reject the paradigm of what symbolizes community and to come out of that state of fear, of vulnerability. And we are no longer living in the times in which there is this, we don't have connectivity. You know, we don't have instant, I mean, how many of you connect on Messenger to people and have instant interaction, right? From all over the world. That connectivity is there. That fear is not necessary. It's not driving us anymore. We don't need to seek that anymore because the individuation process is searching yourself. You're awakening to yourself. And so the path to individuation is the realization that we are awakening to our own individuation process that has its own unique path, that has its own unique fractal, and that we are here to see something that is deeply, deeply encoded within our story. And so every single one of us has an opportunity to witness that story, to witness that awakening process. And Saturn gives you the framework for you to actually see what that's about. And it no longer is about being held to the darkness and to the limitations and the boundaries and the restrictions that is associated with the Saturn archetype. So the need to say, nope, I'm activating my Uranian vehicle, and my Uranian vehicle is taking me there, and my Saturn is now going to be the guiding principle for that. I'm going to digest the emotional experience of the Uranian experience. So it's individuation. It's individuation, separating myself from the collective identity to know who I truly am and how I truly am, how I truly work. And it's a very sensitive experience to actually become aware of. So the future is in your own time and space, from outer authority to inner authority. And so the difference here with this cube and the ball is that the Saturn archetype reflects the cube. It's your box. I mean, how many of you can actually, like, even though I talk about this multidimensionality with regards to Messenger and being able to connect with people instantly, you still can't really travel to wherever that person exists in physical form without having to deal with time, which is the Saturn principle. So we're not actually denying Saturn or getting out of Saturn. What we are simply doing here is we are recognizing that the Saturnian vehicle is where we are, and it will literally be the embodiment of our journey. It's in that place for a reason. The Uranian component is, what does that unique story look like to you? Right? How do you see and observe and digest what that environment is about? And so there, all of a sudden, we don't look at our Saturn and say to ourselves, okay, I'm stuck in this place. And so, it's limiting. We see, okay, this is the cross that we bear, the Saturnian archetype, the box, the three-dimensional space. And then within inside of that, you have your own emotional bubble that you are in, your own space that you're in, literally your own space, right? And you will notice, put up your hands, Pluto and Virgos, that right now, at this point in time, feel this absolute desire to just want to be in your own space and say, I don't want to follow these expectations. I just want to chill out and follow my own vibe, to go with my own motion, and whatever I'm experiencing today, whatever mood I'm in, whatever space I'm in is my own, and I love just being in that space. That's one of the reasons as to why Facebook is so addictive, because when we access that transpersonal space, we're actually, in a sense, numbing out, but we're also like traveling in hyperdimensional state, and we're being in our own space. It's like we can read an article for hours. We can sit and be in our own space for hours and just be present with that. So this collective resonance, this ball that I'm talking about here, is recognizing your own vortex. It's recognizing your own surroundings and how you interact with that. And the box is telling us, what is the cross? What is the environment that is influencing and impacting this little space that you have? I hope that really captures your imagination, because it's about in your own time and space. The path of individuation is the realization that when we are individual in our experience, we have a different time component to, say, for instance, the outside world. because the outside world is not on our fractal. It's not our individuation process. It's on a different time frame. That's why you'll notice that when you look at your physical reality, the people that are around you, okay, are on their own time zone, but they're also in your environment, and they're kind of on the same fractal. They're on the same sort of plane as you. When you begin to see energy and awareness in this way, you begin to notice that the people that are around you are on a similar time frame to you. And that's why you see them. Whereas other people, like for instance, today, we've set a time, right? If you notice on the EA Zoom meetings, there's an intense amount of energy put into saying, if you live in Sweden or if you live in Norway, etc., this is the time zone you're in. And if you're living in Seattle, as an example, when we have a Zoom meeting at 10 o'clock at night in Central European time, it's going to be that for you in Seattle, right? Pacific. The reason why that's the case is so that we can all kind of meet in the same space. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're only in our own space. That is a natural connection to universal time. But in the past, the outer authority has been the conditioning field for everybody to repress their own space, to not know about it, and then to be in the collective's identity of what they define and dictate as the space to be in, which led to people going to work from Monday to Friday and going, oh my God, on Monday, I hate going to work. And on Friday, it's freedom. That psychological state is a conditioning field relative to your space interacting with something that is being dictated by somebody else, in which you need to go to give your time away in order to fulfill the objectives of somebody that has a different time zone to you or a different direction to you. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks, Linda, because I know that we've got our 1 hour at this point in time. I'm sort of like 50% through our conversation today. So collective resonance and individuation is the realization that when you begin waking up to your Uranian field, your own individual space, your Saturn begins to work as a way to help you digest what Uranus is trying to teach you, what Uranus is trying to show you. So when you look at Saturn and Uranus in the chart and you see Saturn as your own authority, your own individual story, and then you look at Uranus as this sort of invitation to awaken you into a path that will eventually lead you to the soul's sort of direction. In other words, the soul says, hey, here's a coded reality that you're going to have unfold for you, just as the Fibonacci sequence unfolds. You're also unfolding just like that. And so when you're on that synchronized path, then you experience the consistent awakening and unfolding of your own future. And this is this inner authority. But you can't have that if you're in an outer authority, because your outer authority is then giving your time and space to something that is a trajectory that is not your own fractal. So therefore, you're not seeing what you're supposed to see. You're not digesting what is awakening you. Therefore, you're never going to experience the truth of your own awakening process, because the digestion of what you're seeing is not actually stimulating what is absolutely there to be stimulated. And so therefore, the future is about a collective resonance where everybody begins to merge with the time and space and Uranian fields and the fractals that will be supportive for every single person's awakening experience. That's why the acceleration I talk about right in the beginning is associated with us merging with people that give us insight in a moment, that change our reality, like accelerate us. And yet at the same time, we're like, wow, that was a cool insight. And it transforms your life instantly. And yet at the same time, you look at your life and the environment is still the same. But you've had a profound shift in awakening. That's the paradox I was talking about. Okay, so maybe what we should do, Linda, is actually take a break, because okay. All right, so the next phase in the sharing has to do with the actual process of not only the nurturing of an individuation experience, but also how to understand the different phases in which we as human beings go through from our birth to the actual process of individuality. So in the description of this video, it was Saturn and the path of individuation, how does this development of the ego get supported that ultimately prepares us for the Uranus opposition. And the Uranus opposition is something that is it's a very profound and very beautiful subject that at some point I wish to actually go deeper into, because it's not something that I think we have a great deal of depth of content on it in the world. From my opinion, at least, I think that we're developing it and we're learning about it and we're already getting it to understand what it's about. But in my opinion, I think that since Uranus and Pluto made a conjunction in 1965, the context of the Uranian vehicle for us is only starting to become more and more and more and more available to us in terms of what it's really about. So what we're looking at right now is the process of the physical birth, okay? So we start out with this physical birth, okay? We know this because this is what happened to us, right? Each and every single one of us will go to our mom, if alive, and say, hey, by the way, do you remember the birthing experience? And 90% of the time they're going to be like, yes, I do remember this random process of allowing another human being to come out of my body. So here we have the physical womb, okay? The physical womb, the birthing process. Our karmic mission begins with the original womb. And the original womb is where we separate from the mother into this physical form. We have our consciousness, we have our DNA, we have the environment that we're in, we have the parent dynamics, in other words, what mom and dad went through when they were growing up and what they are here in their Uranian body, what dad experienced, the family structure that comes along with the parents that we chose, the country that we were born in, the country's state of emotional affairs, the country's consciousness, the world's consciousness at that point when we were born. All of those deep, deep layers are a part and imprinted onto us when we get born. That's a lot. Okay, that's a lot. For this little person to show up in the world, I just shared with you the amount of layers that are ultimately creating the impression that will become part of the existence that you will use is what you see as reality for the next 30 years of your life, right? From 0 to 30, your existence is the first Saturn return, okay? Now think about it. When we take the conditioning field that I was talking about earlier, and we begin to imprint that onto your form, and you don't know that you have the opportunity to say, hey, mom, at the age of 2, this is what Chiron's about. Like the woundedness that sits in Chiron is at the age of 3 years old or the age of 6 months. You have a specific need. How do you get that specific need to be met? You don't have any words. You can't articulate yourself. We're living in a world in which where parents are conditioned by outer authority to tell us what to do because of our own insecurities around what we don't trust about our instinctual ways of being. So what happens is we go, okay, you need to be fed like this. You need to have these feeding routines. You need to do this. You need to do that. And then what happens is the body shows up and says, hey, by the way, I don't want to be fed by this type of food. And the way I'm going to show it is I'm going to have a rash. But when we see a rash come up on a baby, we never think, hold on, let's investigate what that might emotionally mean, and then see how my behavior and the environment might be interacting with me or with the baby. And that baby is telling you through the physical form, Saturn, that this is not something that I'm comfortable with. It's not part of what I need. Because we can't speak up for ourselves, we get conditioned. And slowly but surely, the individuation of ourself becomes conditioned by the environment and by the way of being, and we forget who we are. Chiron, right? The sensitivity to the uniqueness that we are gets slowly but surely aged out through this process. And it's nothing, it's not nobody's fault. It's not like, oh, you know what, mom, dad, you should have listened to me better, or you know what, it's not about that. I'll give you an example. Okay. My youngest daughter, is probably my greatest teacher from a Pluto polarity point of view. In other words, my Pluto in the 10th house, polarity point being in the 4th. She's deeply, deeply emotional in her process. And she's very sensitive to being rushed. She's very, very sensitive to being controlled. She's very sensitive to emotional imprinting around things in which are forced from her. And now I know that my own personal story has a lot of trauma around, like, hey, I need to assert this. I need to assert this experience. And she teaches me to be softer with her, a lot softer with her. Anyway, so she shows up, and when she was eating between the ages of, she still does it right now, but I'm a lot more aware of this process and actually allow it to happen. But in the beginning, when she eats food, she likes to have a lot of chaos with her. She doesn't eat her food unless she's walking or moving or creating chaos. Whereas for me, I hate that. I hate eating under chaos. I like calm things. So when she's eating, she's creating chaos, and I'm trying to calm things, and we're interacting with each other. And I'm like, Skylar, stop it. Like, calm down, sit, focus on your food. And that's the opposite of what she is. Do you see how just by me wanting what I need for my own personal thing, I'm telling her to forget about what is natural for her and her digestion and the way that she takes in, because of my own personal relationship to not understanding her. And this is the phase, this is the potential in this conversation today with everybody, is the awakening to ask ourselves, hey, what is your own personal story when you're looking to another person? What is unique about yourself? Maybe you might not want to be rushed in an experience, and I'm rushing you in needing to get this done. Maybe you feel anxiety, or you feel your nervous system not being able to handle it. So what is unique for you? And this is where the process of, I was sharing with somebody in the break around that this is my vision, this is this path that I'm on, that this is awakening with inside of myself. But the context, the background story that I really feel that will be so helpful is when we begin to understand how we can actually support those individual needs and speak up for ourselves, to give ourselves the capacity to have that voice that says, hey, this is not something that's correct for me. So I'm not going to enter this experience because I know that this is not going to transform me. This is not going to be supportive of me. And so for most of us that are on the planet right now, this first 30 years, for most of us, the conditioning field has really, really not been something that's supportive of us. Okay. And again, it's nobody's fault. It's just the way that we are and where we are. But this is changing slowly but surely. This process is changing into a more deeply individuating process. So you're conditioned by the people. You're conditioned to be conditioned. You're born to be conditioned. This is the physical womb, the karmic mission that you come into this lifetime with between 0 and 30. And so at 7 years old, you begin to develop your first Saturn square. And that's when you recognize your mortality. And remind me to let everybody know that I've just recently released a 2.5 hour presentation that goes through the Saturn cycles and talks about the Saturn archetype and how to access it in the astrology chart, from recognizing the shadow and path individuation. And also there's a 30-minute MP3 as well on this, this PDF content around digesting the Saturn return. So I go into like a lot of detail on that PDF. So after this is done, I'll let you know where to go and get that download. And it goes into depth of what I'm talking about here in terms of the first 30 years being so much about the process of you being conditioned and that conditioning field and how your ego gets developed. It's not a coincidence at the age of 21, when you have your third Saturn square and your Uranus first square, that's this need to break out of the family structure and say, hey, I want to go out on my own. I want to go and, live in my apartment for the first time and be responsible for myself. And I kind of need to break away from the family values and the traditions and what mom says and dad says. I want to find my own sovereignty. So we begin this process. And a lot of the time, we are deeply, deeply conditioned by outer authority that when we reach our Saturn return, we go through this 2-year cycle of needing to like really, really reflect on the nature of what has been the conditioning field and the development of our ego up until this point in time. And this is the potential in the Saturn return. The potential in the Saturn return is to see that the 2 years in which life slows down so much, and that life comes to this head, and in this moment that you're dealing with this, everything becomes serious. The potential in the Saturn return, as it leads to the path of individuation, is to begin cutting out and surrendering and clearing the conditioning field that was part of your story. Okay, and this is really interesting, because when you look at the astrology and you look at the unique path that your soul holds for itself, and you see when your Saturn return comes along, the context of that story will become available to you. It's not like you have to just guess that out of nowhere. What could possibly be the case? If your Saturn sitting in the 10th house Scorpio, and your family history of conditioning has to do with all the men in the ancestral karma that didn't have their fathers live beyond the age of 40, that don't have authority, and that were deeply traumatized, then when I have Saturn come into the 10th house and I look back and I go, yeah, you're right. All of the male figures in my life were completely and utterly disempowered or completely abusive, and didn't even show me in any way what a healthy boundary looked like. So here is my Saturn return, comes up and it says, hi, we would like to teach you about what healthy boundaries are. And part of your individuation process is recognizing this important emotional dynamic. And the way that you're going to learn it is through recognizing how your boundaries just keep on being abused, or like you allow your own personal space to be abused because you don't know how to assert your boundaries in place, because it's never been there. You have not had a healthy sense of identity that could allow that to be the case. It's either completely distorted or it's been absent. Okay, thank you very much, Saturn return. I'll go and reflect upon the context of that and recognize what is occurring. And this is the key. The key from Saturn all the way to the Uranus opposition, the importance of the Saturn energy, the Saturn return, is beginning to awaken where you have the shadow. The shadow of Saturn is where we don't take responsibility for our own wounding. We don't take responsibility for our emotional development that has been traumatized or been displaced, or that we have not had the opportunity to develop healthy structures in our lives. And so this process leads us into, and this is not everybody, by the way, there are a lot of people out there that I'm sure are even on this call that have had a healthy Saturn development. Mom and dad were very supportive. You know, you knew how to nurture yourself and you knew how to assert your authority. And that's fantastic. And I'm super happy that that's the case. And that will be a beautiful thing for you, because when your Saturn return comes around, it's all about environment. The physical womb is the conditioning field that supports you to your Saturn return. And then when your Saturn return comes around, the whole entire change is changing you into the correct path for when you will begin saying, this is where I'm going to place my structure. This is where I'm going to commit to. This is why everybody settles down between this period of time generally, because, or feels this importance to want to like become serious, is because this is the time when you begin to plant the cross of your environment. Saturn, the cross, your karma. You begin to say, this is where I'm going to emotionally begin to develop and cultivate. This is where I'm going to plant my tree. But before I plant the tree, I need to recognize that the environment for planting my tree, Uranus opposition, is healthy. So I need to take the spade, I need to take the watering can, I need to take the fork, and I need to go into the bed and dig up and soften the soil, which is the hardening and the conditioning factors that are not you. And you begin working on your garden. That is the environment. Is the environment correct for you? Are you seeing what is there to awaken you? And so for me, the awakening process for myself, the environment, was that Pluto 10th house, and I have 2 children after my Saturn return that not only do the very thing to activate my own individuation process, but also give me the tools necessary to do the very thing that I feel so called to do. And both of them contain that little energy within inside of themselves. And they're like, there we go, we'll teach you what to do. And the way that you will learn about this is by applying it in your own life. You will literally nurture and soften this in you. And by doing that, you will get closer to us. And by doing that, you will actually heal that Saturn, that Saturn in the 10th house Scorpio. You'll re-empower your feeling of wanting to heal the patriarchal wounds of the distorted masculine principle. And we will show you this. And we will hold space for you to do that. And so the environment for me from the age of 30 up until the age of 40 will be the conditioning field. And every single day I have to show up Saturn and say, this is my discipline. This is where the work is, right? And I slowly but surely digest and align and cultivate the environment. And so for most of us, if we get past our Saturn return and we go from the 30 to the 40, the environment might not be correct for us. And we need to go and decondition ourselves. Whereas when we begin to live in this Uranian component and we begin to cultivate awareness in which individuation is an essential part, then what will happen is that by the time a child reaches their Saturn return, they'll be like, okay, cool. I know how to make decisions that are correct for myself. I know how to know what is necessary for me to see. And so therefore I don't need to decondition myself as much as, say, for instance, somebody that will just awaken into their Saturn return, and then the Saturn return doesn't just end at 28 or from 28 to 30. It actually is from 28 all the way to Uranus opposition. It's that conditioning field that becomes the environment for you to see what is essential for you to awaken or not. And that's why most people at the Uranus opposition in this process will have a crisis, a meltdown, because basically everything up until that point in time has been just working, Saturn, but then disassociating until the Uranus opposition comes along, and then all of a sudden they're like, look, I'm leaving this relationship because, or I'm buying the fancy car, right? The midlife crisis. This is not just a random occurrence. It's because of the repression that exists within the context of the Uranian energy that is not nurtured, that is not cultivated, that leads to the midlife crisis experience, where the shock and change leads to the rejection and the judgments and the persecution and the trauma. When somebody says, that's it, I'm changing my path. I mean, this is exactly what the Uranus opposition is about. From 40 years onwards, the individuation path is where we look at this tree over here and we say, the old self that was the physical womb is now being surrendered. We are letting go of it and we are birthed into a new reality. And it's a spiritual birthing process. So the first phase of your intense sort of labor pains between the ages of 38 and 44 is the inconjunct that takes place, Uranus inconjunct natal Uranus. And this is when you begin to experience the frustration of your limit, like your environment going, it's no longer, it's too small for me. I'm going to break out of it. I want to individuate in this process. And then the individuation process exists, which is the exact Uranus opposition. That's when we take the leap of faith. And then the next phase is the 210 degree inconjunct, which is the Scorpio axis, which is about where we begin to break out and we begin to place the seeds within this bed that we just sort of cultivate for ourselves. And so we have a spiritual birth. We actually get born again, but it's not a physical birth. It's actually being born out of the physical womb that was the conditioning field for the first 38 years of your life. Do you see it? So Saturn holds the conditioning up until the 28th and then becomes a framework in which you begin to be conditioned. Remember this, guys. If your brain and your eyesight and your senses are just stimulated in one environment for 10 years, think about how your brain is going to develop in response to that. So do you see how important it is to recognize that in your individuation, the Saturn return, you're actually getting into alignment with what you're here to see? And I know that looks funny, but that's really what it is. Because in that period of time, if you're in the right environment and you're actually cultivating and grounding yourself into the physical form, the Saturn becomes the framework for the Uranian energy to be brought into. Whereas when it doesn't, when that work doesn't get done and the structures doesn't get laid out from 28 up until 38, then the process of Uranus just comes and fractures it. And so the birthing process becomes very, very difficult So we are born again into our unique path. And so that's where the Uranian component will actually become activated for us. So I wanted to share this with everybody today. In the old paradigm, Saturn was the conditioning field that told you to, like I shared right at the beginning, the conditioning field, our need for sensitivity, the need for our sensitivity, who is sensitive to meet our needs for survival in our vulnerable state, that would eventually become the way that we would exist. And that came through community. And so Saturn was time. And so we lived in time, and we've been living in time based on a outer structure. And that outer structure has been the framework for what we have constituted as life. And this framework progressively is becoming changed as we begin to take our authority from outside of ourselves and place it inwardly. And this is something that's really important. When you look at the lineup for the people that are talking today, you'll see that there's 2 talks on Neptune. One of them is Bradley talking about Neptune in Capricorn, the generation. And I don't know what he's going to talk about, but there's a sense in which the essence of Neptune in Capricorn with Uranus in Capricorn and that generation is what I'm talking about when I say that in your own time. Because notice how all of the Pluto and Scorpios and the millennials and the type of judgments that we place in them and how they're breaking down the system, because everybody's then up responding to the fear of, hey, the system was working and now we have to change and adjust, and that's uncomfortable and my routines are changing, and now all of a sudden everything is on an app, whereas before I could just go to the bookstore. Like the whole entire context of this thing is becoming fractured because of that Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. And with Neptune and Capricorn, it's the essence of your own time. Where are you in your own time? And so all of a sudden, love, time, and art becomes this beautiful equation when we begin to see that as we awaken to our own individual process, okay, Uranus is our energy. It's the electrical field within us. That electrical field is the excitement, it's the creativity. You can feel it off me today. It's like, oh, wow, this is super exciting. How many of you have felt super excited about something and it's just electrified you, right? This is the Uranian component. It's like you feel that you're in individuation, you're in your element. Saturn comes along and says, when you ground that process through time, you create art. And so time and the universe, the universal law of time is encoded where love and time comes through our Uranian component. So what we do is we recognize what is the individuation process for us, and how does Saturn reveal to us that process, that step-by-step process. So when I created this slide, and when any of you have created your own slides to your presentation, anything, you took your time. And what did you do in that time? You encoded your electricity, and that electricity became your art. So the equation of love and time and art is love, and time is an associated product of this. It is in our own time relative to our own individuation process that creates our creative experience, that creates our art. So when every one of us steps into that process and awakens that within ourselves, our unique voice, our authentic voice becomes available. Not the conditioned one, not the one that we were told to have, not the one that we do out of expectation, out of demand, but simply our unique voice. And when that occurs, we will start to notice that everything doesn't become centralized, it becomes decentralized, anarchy takes place, and all of a sudden a natural forming of groups begin to exist, where Saturn reveals to us the path to that group in which we belong to, and which the community exists within, that is natural to us, that awakens us, that stimulates what we're here to see, that transforms us. When I was creating this slide over here, literally this one, energy, Uranus, time, when I downloaded the slide after working it with it on Canva, there's a little quote at the bottom. Every time you download something off Canva, it creates a little quote. And the quote that was associated with this downloading after I created this graphic was, creativity is intelligence having fun, Albert Einstein. And I just giggled at the synchronicity, because not only was this me in the process of going, oh, wow, how do I express the electrical field? How do I express time? And I'm in my own space. I'm loving it. Time is evaporating at it took me like 25 minutes to create this, but I didn't feel like it was taking 25 minutes at all. I just felt pure resonance with myself. I felt my individuation process. I felt the creativity. I felt the inspiration. And there were no boundaries in place. It's Neptune in Capricorn, the dissolving of the boundaries to feel our own individuation process. So creativity, Sun, is intelligence having fun. Albert Einstein, right? And that person, we know, revolutionized the way that we interacted with things. And he's all over the internet because he was the one that acted in a Uranian way, but you can also see the judgments that were associated with it. So I'm going to end off this conversation here, because I'm going to look at some charts that we've got. And I just want to, yeah, so I'll end that. Okay, thanks very much, Linda. So let's have a look. Did we had everybody's charts available? Let me just see where I downloaded them here. So it's okay to share your chart, Cameron. I see you walking over there at the moment.
Yes, you can share it.
Okay. Let's see if, whoops. I wonder, I hope it doesn't lose its, there we go. So you can actually see that there's a tremendous amount of Capricorn in Cameron's chart, right? Mars in Capricorn, Uranus in Capricorn, Neptune in Capricorn, as we talked about, Saturn in Capricorn, Mercury, Venus, and then you have a boatload of Uranus that sits over there as well. And you actually have the very thing that I'm talking about over here in your chart. You've got this second house, 11th house energy, and then you've got the inconjunct that takes place to the 7th house. So here's the Cancer archetype. Actually, I'll do this over here. Here in your chart, you've got the Cancer archetype sitting there in the 7th house. So we're really dealing with somebody that is wanting to but interact with the community in which their belief systems are in relation to their unique values. And so much of the Capricorn that sits in the 1st house says, what type of environment did you grow up in that represented a need to break out of? I mean, it just is just a basic looking, looking at your chart over here. But then you even have Pluto in the 11th house. It is in the 11th house, right? Or is that at 17 degrees? It's in the 11th house. Your Pluto's in the 11th house?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So the core of your whole entire soul has come to individuate itself. And you can see those archetypes that I was talking about earlier. Cancer, the 7th house, the 2nd house of the astrology chart, and then the Capricorn archetype, the conditioning field. So do you want to share a little bit about your chart in terms of how your own individuation process was working?
Well, yeah, I guess my whole life, just with my family, I was just always different. You know, I would always ask why. So that was the biggest thing when I was younger. And my dad, he didn't respond well to why. He would just, it's because I said so, which was literally the thing that would keep me pushing forward. You have something to say? Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was going to say that that's the very thing that I'm talking about that conditioning field, because I said so, right? I'm the authority. I'm the elder.
Right. Yeah. Because when he gave me answers, I would be totally fine. Even if it wasn't the one that I wanted, that's fine. It's just like, just don't box me in with no, explanation. But yeah. So I grew up with that, for a long time. My mom, she wasn't like that much though. She was more, nurturing, like how it let me communicate and stuff like that. And then once I got to like middle school, I just didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to believe. There was people, they thought things. I moved. Everybody just had all these opinions, and I just wanted to just be free all the time. And I would be in school, and I would talk to my friends, and I would get in trouble, and I would basically not be damned necessarily, but I would like, yeah, I would just get in trouble from school because I would talk all the time, but I wasn't really doing anything wrong. But then they would like guilt me and paint me like I was like not a necessarily a bad kid, but like breaking the rules. So
Right. So there's that storyline around coming into a conditioning field in which the very nature of your own process would challenge things. And it's not necessarily challenging it because I want to be a rebel. It's just, I'm just naturally curious. I'm just wanting to understand stuff. I'm just Gemini moon in the fifth house, right?
right.
I'm just curious. And yet that curiosity leads you into interacting with people and in environments that themselves are not fully aware of the conditioning, that they are, in a sense, just, we're all just regurgitating the conditioning field. But you will come in and say, hey, I'm gonna step outside that realm. So how does it, this is the point here with the feelings, is how did your own experience of accepting yourself be a traumatic storyline? Like being outside of the community field and having to follow your own individuation process influence your own emotional development, your own need to find your own sovereignty, your own authority, Saturn in the first house.
To me, I guess it's just in every situation I would always just feel boxed in, because if I was being myself, then not necessarily nothing, I didn't care about anything, but nothing would matter. I would just continuously move through life, like that first house thing, just
Yeah.
instinctually I would move through life. If something wasn't going on that was like life threatening, I pretty much wouldn't care about it, and I would just do what I want to do naturally,
Okay.
like instinctually. And then over time, I just would feel more and more repressed by people saying what I couldn't do. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that. So then I started having a lot of anger.
Okay.
And then so that's how I liberated myself through anger, and then taking anger management. And like they would teach me coping skills, and I would take like multiple coping skills and use them all at once. And then I would start asking myself why. And I went to college and I started learning psychology.
Okay.
And I got into Carl Jung, and that's when I started learning how to liberate myself in the individuation process. So my second year in college, I told myself I'm going to learn how to decondition. I'm going to try to wipe myself clean. And this was before I knew astrology. So
Right.
I just went on the path of doing that, and that I took some entheogenic plants, which liberated me a lot. That was one thing that I feel like really liberated me. It was like entheogenic plants. They helped me detach from myself so that I could see that some of these things that were going on just weren't natural. So when I came back to that, I was
Yeah.
okay with it, even though I would still get emotionally wounded essentially from the way people receive me. So that process is continual. That's continuing to happen now. It's like if I want to be free and just do something, somebody else takes offense to it. They say I don't care. I feel some type of way about it. I get hurt, and then I'm like, oh, I'm hurt because of this, and now I just continue to perpetuate that.
So do you feel like when you talk about that story of dealing with anger, Mars conjunct Uranus in the first house, and yet Saturn's there as well, in some way, also inviting you to dissolve that anger through, or that repression, through finding new ways to transcend those limitations. So using plant medicine would be a way in which that would come to you, right? And also actually going into your subconscious with the works of Carl Jung in college, with Mars and Uranus as well. Like there's absolutely a need here, a need, second house sun sign in Aquarius, to individuate yourself. And part of the process, I feel, and I'm super curious to hear, is that with the South Node in the 8th house Leo and the North Node, they're on top of that sun sign, and then the square that Pluto has to it, how communities can be something that can support you, but also can actually stimulate a sense of, if you wanted to break free from that or stand outside the values of the community, how rejection plays out, whether the abandonments that other people feel versus your own feelings of feeling that you are abandoning people, and should you feel guilty for that. I'm super curious if that's
Yeah,
what I heard in the most recent thing you just said.
yes, that happens in every situation. Because I'll come into a community or a group, and everybody will be like yay, or like I like you, you're cool, you're awesome, and I'm just doing my thing. And as I continue to do my thing, later on people are like, well, this is how it should be. And I'm like, well, I don't care, you know, or I will not say I don't care, recognize within myself how I feel about it, and be like, wow, like I'm not doing this because I don't want these people to feel this way about me.
Okay.
So
So,
it's
so there's,
continuously, it's like, doo, 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 doo. And I'm just like playing with it inside of myself at this point now too. And seeing how much I can push it further and further and further. How vulnerable can I make myself? How scared can I be and still just do it? You know, it's
right.
that's the process all the time. Also, Kundalini yoga helps too. Yeah.
Yeah, Mars and Uranus, I can definitely see how that is an essential part of your own kind of structure with the Kundalini experience, moving the energy up the spine, right? The structure, the body, Saturn, and then the Uranian component, the electricity. So, and to even go deeper into that, because the context of the conversation is path of individuation. So your individuation process does require you with Saturn in the first house to actually be that sovereign person. You actually have to be your own parent. And when you look at your own parents, do they have conditioning factors in which their own authority may or may not have been given to them? Like with mom, for instance, when she was nurturing you as a, you got Jupiter in Cancer, and so there's an element of maybe having a nurturer in your home that you could feel safe with. But did you feel like she could reach her dreams, or did she sacrifice herself for the greater good of a community type in which she said, okay, this is what my role is, and stepping outside that role meant I had to, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what she did. That's exactly what she did. She
So
quit her
that's
job. She started working her own business. That's exactly what she did.
right.
And she didn't have her father. Her father died at a young age.
Okay. Do you think
So she had to help support the family. So that's
so? There's another Saturn story there, in the sense that you've got that Saturn in the first house. You show up where both parents probably showed you that in order to get ahead in life, again from an outside authority, an external authority conditioning up until you, because you're the generation with Uranus and Neptune and Saturn and all of that in Capricorn going, nope, internal reality, internal space, in my own time. Like, do you generally feel like I mean, maybe this is not the right question to ask on the public, so I'll just I'll end that over there just in case people watch. But the point that I was wanting to make was, did both your parents feel as if they entered their life and their individuation process in a way that they wanted to, or did they choose it because that was what was told to them as the most safest road? And then how did they want to impart that onto you? Maybe not mom so much, because maybe she felt more.
right. Yeah. It was literally just, I have this imprint. Now you have it.
Right.
It was literally that. And my dad's son is opposed my son. So it's like he was putting it directly on me.
Okay.
And I had to watch it occur. I had to watch it occur to my brother as well.
So part of your own healing process, your individuation process, is to actually break the authority. Because this is something that I wanted to talk about in the conversation as well, was that, and this is actually in the PDF video series that I'd created. And it talks about having to step outside the conditioning of our parents and into our individuation process. So we actually literally have to step out of the shadow of what our parents wanted for us, because that was what they perceived is important for us, and into what was essential for us. And that is a very big thing to actually break as our conditioning. So dad would have probably encouraged you so deeply, and probably maybe even to a certain degree because he cared for you, even though he might have not known that the caring was coming from his own perception of what he thought was correct for you, and said, Cameron, you got to do this. And then you kind of failed him. How many of us are sitting on the call right now in which we want to prove to our parents the acceptance, the wanting of love? And then when we step outside of that realm of what they perceive as what they're going to give love to us, and we individuate ourselves, how many of us do really feel as if we choose individuation, our parents will still love us? That's the emotional work. That's part of the step-by-step process. This realization that that part of the shadow with our Saturn is really going, look, mom and dad, Saturn in the first house, I carry the karma in which, in order to get things done, I had to just shoulder responsibility. I had to shoulder responsibility for the tribe and for the collective. And these were the rules. And if I stepped outside of that and said, hey, I want to be different, then that was not welcomed. And maybe there was, even with this type of chart over here, a potential excommunication out of the community with that Pluto in that 11th house, that your soul carries at a deeper level around feeling as if, hey, this group, will you really embrace me? Can I really speak up and say, hey, can I be seen? And my uniqueness is so radical at times that maybe it might put you into like shock other people to feel as if their own emotional and vulnerabilities around what their definitions of safety are being threatened. And then how does that get projected onto you? And that becomes then who, yeah. So maybe that Chiron in the 7th house in Cancer plays out as other people's emotional identities being placed onto you that you can then osmose with and go, oh, this is who I am, but really it's not at all.
Yeah, and I would get isolated because in school I would literally get sent into a place in school where I would be suspended, but in school, isolated from all the other classrooms.
Yeah.
And one time, like a few times in football, I got like kicked off the team, not necessarily kicked off, but like suspended off of that too. They separated me from everybody else.
Right. And then how did you internalize that process that now becomes a conditioning factor for where you are right now in your life, considering that you're actually about to go through your Saturn return? So how does that begin to influence? I mean, this is just a general question for you to contemplate, because I do want to move over to another chart, but how those types of experiences may or may not be the influencing factor that you just need to get rid of and say, you know what, that's other people's projections of their insecurities placing me there. And I can actually just love myself and be unique. And I have something revolutionary to say. And the communities that are correct for me will see me and recognize me. Right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to take up the other person's time. So I appreciate that though. Yeah, I feel that.
Cool, dude. Really, really happy to hear that. Okay, so where is the annotation button so I can just clear that out? Alexandra.
Hi.
Let me see where you are on the call. I can't actually. Oh, hold on. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let me just press the button over here to make the screen bigger. Okay, your Saturn sits in Libra, right?
Yes.
Okay. And your Uranus sits in Sagittarius in the 3rd house, and it's right in the edge of that cusp between the Pluto and Libras that were born where they're learning about relationships, but they have this conditioning field of abandonment, loss, and betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And then the ones that have got Saturn in Sagittarius, like me and you, for instance, where the nature of relationships is more around what is your personal truth more than, and so what's natural to you, what's natural in a relationship. Are you looking for a relationship that has honesty and naturalness versus maybe the kind of context of this relationship dynamic where Uranus is in Scorpio and it's all about abandonment and unfairness and betrayal within the context of how relationships work. So do you have a relationship with somebody at the moment?
Yes, I'm married.
You're married, yeah?
Yeah, and we are a long time together.
Okay.
We were a long time before we got married, but it wasn't open relationship in the sense that we were separate or something like that. We were living together, but we have a lot of personal space. So
Okay.
we respect a lot of, we respect a lot each personal space, need for some activities different, than we don't need to be together all the time. And that's what I love about our relationship, because we are together, but in the same time as free as much as we can.
That's really, really amazing to hear. So is your partner or your husband older than you?
No, we are about the same age. Actually,
Okay.
same age. He's older just few months.
He's older by a few months. So okay. Do you know if his Uranus is in Scorpio?
Of course, yes.
Okay.
Next to my moon.
Next to your moon. Okay. So you definitely sort of like it's really amazing to hear what you share there, because your Saturn in Libra, you know, so much of your how did when you were growing up, was mom and dad, did you see gender inequality when you were growing up with mom and dad? Did you feel like
yeah, but they were in their chaos all the time.
Yeah.
Because between them there is much of love. You can say that even now. But in some they had in some periods they had big crisis. So for me, I was a little bit strange kid, because at the point when it was really getting too much thing going on, and I just stopped them. Okay, if you want like that, it's better to separate. We can arrange everything. And I was about 14, 15 years old. So for them that was a shock, because then they realized, okay, now it was too much for kids. Now you should calm down. And there was, because in my country when I live, there was a lot of those all gender roles while I was growing up. You know, women should do this, men should do that. Some things are inappropriate for women, and it's just not my way of doing and living. I don't know. I cannot accept that as the way of living now.
That's really good to hear, because did you say around the age of 14, 15 that you were talking about the separation?
Yeah.
Okay, so there, can you see in Alexandra's chart, you've got these 4 points, right? So you've got Saturn when you were born, Saturn when it's at 7 years old, which is on your Venus. So something happened around 7 years old, around your childhood, in which I'm super curious to hear. And then the separation, Saturn in Aries in the 8th house, in terms of a completely new direction, and how that actually began to influence how your own personal soul is, you know, developing its trajectory in this lifetime. And you can see here that this chart has so much to do with breaking down the expectations that are in relationships, and how those expectations are placed on you and on other people, and maybe even the repression, the repression of what's natural. So when you talk about your relationship to your husband, and the one that you have, it's beautiful to hear, because so much of this individuation process is to break down the gender roles, and the communication must be a very important thing between you around what is, you know, what do you want to do and what I want to do, and how clear communication must be between you in order for you to feel that sense of balance in the relationship.
For me, actually, when I met him, I was in one phase of intensive works and development, because as you can see, I have my Mars on my ascendant, so I was always a tomboy. And I was really trying to develop that my feminine side, and to recognize it and acknowledge, especially because of conditioning and gender roles and everything. So I just needed to find my new way of expressing that.
Wow.
And the main thing when we met, it was, okay, it doesn't matter how much it will last, but let's make something really good. And if it lasts, it's not that I want him to be something, I don't know, to live by my expectations. It's just for me, the relationship that I want, it's not always that it's normal. We're a couple and everything is many things are happening. But the main purpose actually is just to be able to recognize the other as a being, not just in the role that he has in my life, and to be able to be support for his expression and for his development. And the only thing that I expect from him is to do that for me also. That's all.
Right.
So I really yes, I had a hard time in my parents' relationship, but it wasn't something like for me that I would say, oh, I'll never go into the relationship. Yes, I will, but I just need to have different quality of the relationship and really recognition and respect. And when that's in place, there's not much problem.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for sharing that. So that, I mean, it's just amazing to see how your chart is just showing up here. And, you know, for you personally, with the Uranus over here, there's definitely something to communicate to us around a different way of our values and or belief systems and what's natural for us. And I think part of the gender deconditioning that you are contained, that is contained in the chart, is how that each of us have a different voice, and that voice is not to be conditioned by an idea or an identity. So if you're a woman, that you only have a voice and your empowerment of your voice only comes through this, that each of us has a voice that is unique and that's something to share. And it doesn't matter which gender we are, because ultimately with Libra over here, we can embody both, you know, with Neptune in the 4th house over there and your North Node in Cancer, there's a kind of like maybe a potential story around an androgynous self-identity where both the masculine and the feminine principle are equal within inside. And sometimes you can express a polarity of life that is feminine and receptive, and then there's a part of you that can be deeply masculine and assert your direction, and just being sensitive to the two in that sense.
Yes, and I really feel that what you said, because each of us needs to develop both sides and to have strongly develop both sides in order to have that balance.
That's right.
Libra.
Yeah. So I'm super curious to hear, did you get married when you had a Saturn return, or?
No, I didn't. I married 2 years ago.
How many?
2 years ago, and it was, and we got engaged 2014, but we were together so many years, but it was more conscious decision to get married than just I need my wedding ring, I need my marriage, I need my wedding party. It was okay. Now we are ready both. We can do it, and we did it. So that's it.
That's another thing to hear in the Saturn and all the Libra in the chart, is how you got married not because of I need a ring, or it just is like I need a piece of paper, or we're gonna get when a marriage, because again Libra starts over here. The conditioning field is when you get married, it means this, and to you, you're redefining the way that a relationship works through just being together and being in harmony, which is natural, and just being with somebody that can recognize you for who you are and not for what it symbolizes outwardly.
Cool. Yes.
So Linda just shared with me that we've got not so much time left, but if you feel like you want to share something more on that, Alexandra, feel free to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything, and it was really nice lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm happy to share that over there. So I think that's it from my side. Is there anybody that's got some a question that they want to ask just before, or talk about just before we end today's conversation?
SΥmონ, I think you did mention Chiron a little bit earlier on. What's Chiron's role in all of this?
Awesome. On my YouTube channel, actually on my Patreon page, which I wanted to share, if you want to go and check out what I'm doing at the moment, Patreon and the platform Patreon has a lot of this content. And there's a video that I created that talks about Chiron and its role. And to me, Chiron is this energetic sensitivity that allows us to connect the physical body to the Uranian awareness. So in order for us to recognize our awareness, we need to be sensitive to this within ourselves. And I think Chiron is that place within the chart that is so unique to us, that is so sensitive within ourselves. And so like in Cameron's case, as an example with Chiron in the 7th house Cancer, that the way that he connects his Uranus and his Saturn in his chart, it comes through the sensitivity of being able to understand how other people see him, and how his individuality is either being, how he's breaking out of that mold. I mean, there's a lot more depth into that context, but like for me as an example, my Chiron sits in the 5th house in Gemini at 1 degree, but it in conjuncts my Pluto and my Saturn and my Sun sign and my Mercury. And I know that with my Uranus in my chart, it wants to break out of a belief system that is held deeply in these like sadomasochism belief systems, Mars Venus in Virgo, and my Uranus contacts my Mars and Venus. It wants to break out of these patterns of disempowered relationship patterns. And one of the ways that comes through is the sensitivity in the way in which communication is heard. How do we communicate with each other? What language do we use when we're interacting with each other? And how that's deeply connected with my soul, so that the Chiron has such a profound vibration. And I think it's so underdeveloped within our stories at this stage, and we're learning about Chiron. But to me, it's really about how we it's that sensitivity that's so unique to us, that can't be understood by another person, because it's the bridge between our emotional development and our subconscious, and how that gets developed. Like, how do we actually merge those two together? The subconscious memories that are multidimensional, and our emotional awareness in the moment.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Star, go ahead.
Hi, SΥmµN.
Hey, Star.
So when you said that when you choose the path of individuation, and the parents, like, in a sense, maybe withdrawal, approval, affection, or love, I just really resonated with that, because I've always been like a really individuated, rebellious soul. And there's times where, like, I can feel that pull away from my own father. And I've been able to think, like, wow, I wish I could just conform a little bit more to maybe gain or earn his love. That would be so, quote unquote, nice.
Yeah.
But then, a deeper part of me is like, but that's not really love. I don't want that anyways, because then he would be loving me for what I'm doing, not who my essential nature and being is.
Yes.
So in a sense, I just reject this whole thing entirely. So when you spoke to that being where the work really is, I just thought that was really, really profound. And both of my parents are in the Pluto in Leo generation. So they definitely have that, where they put their own narcissism or me being an extension of what they want instead of honoring who I am. So the fact that you're able to do that and be aware of that with your own children is just really beautiful. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, ultimately, that what you just shared right now is the context of this conversation, because that has been my experience. My experience has been that not only have I had 4 parents, 2 biological, that were all 4 of them Pluto and Leos, and that was my experience. And so now I know from my own wounding through that narcissism, that's the very thing that I need to give my children, is that. And so I do that, and that birthed this out here. And it's that essential, just as I'll end off here, Linda, that right at the core of it, we need to survive. And that survival comes through the attention we create. And as children and as babies, the only way we can do it is through looking at the parent. And then when we get to the individuation cycle, that whole entire complex of emotional recognition that wasn't established or wasn't done, where we've internalized that it's our fault, prevents us from stepping into our individuation, because we fear that nobody will love us. We fear that nobody will accept us or embrace us. We fear our empowerment. And so therefore we don't do it. And then ultimately it becomes a surrender of your truth to a collective experience that you just become disillusioned, dissolved into. And that's what,
Great, thank you so much. Just a quick comment in the chat box, not wishing to lump all of the Pluto and Leo parents together. I guess, yeah.
What did you say, Linda?
Somebody in the chat box has said they one should not really lump all the Pluto in Leo parents together.
No, that's completely true. And thank you for bringing that up. And I do apologize for kind of creating a generalization, because I've met Pluto Leo parents that have nurtured their children in completely Uranian ways, to the point where it's just been inspiring to me. So I thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate your voice there. And it's completely the truth. They're not one size fits all. Okay,
brilliant. I want to thank you so much for this amazing double meeting, SΥmµον. Would you all please thank SΥmµον Vorster, Cameron, and Alexandra, everyone?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant, SΥmµon. Thanks, Cameron and Alexandria.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.